Firstly, good morning, everybody, and thanks very much to the EGBA for inviting me along to share the findings of the study with you. It's actually been a really, really interesting project to work on over the last couple of months. As Dave says, we were invited, or we were asked to undertake an engagement to compare the terms and conditions on the websites of the 6 member firms, primarily of the EGBA. We were asked to compare members in both Denmark and the United Kingdom so we could get a comparison across both jurisdictions. And I think those 2 jurisdictions were specifically chosen purely because EGBA members have licenses, or all of them have licenses in those countries. So it provided a really good baseline for comparison. But as well as looking at the member firms, as Dave has already said, we were asked to look at a number of different sectors that provided services online, primarily targeted at adult activities. So things like you'll see there, social media platforms, looking at financial services, relationship and dating sites, looking at alcohol retailers, and also video gaming and esports. Just to make clear, the study wasn't intended to be a competitive exercise to determine how one sector or whether one sector was stronger than another. The intentions were purely just to look at the protections in place within the gambling companies, but actually how they also fitted in line or fitted in line with the protections provided by the other online sectors. You can see there we've detailed the 5 different distinct areas that we had a look at. So that first one, know your customer. And looking at that, we focused on things like identity and age verification and other ways in which companies get to know their clients. We looked at customer safety, so things like usage, tracking time and spending where that was appropriate, as well as different matters that would result in suspension of accounts across the board, but also actually how easy was it for customers to contact customer service. Data protection, so our study incorporated privacy provisions, things like the use of cookies, how well users were advised that the integrity of their data and how the data was actually used and stored. Anti-money laundering, so looking at that's obviously a very hot topic at the moment across a lot of different industries, but we looked at how maybe suspicions were reported, ongoing monitoring of customers as well. So we didn't just look at money laundering, but we kind of focused on others, so kind of fraud and other illegal means. And then finally, advertising, we looked really at how third-party agreements and how customers were advised that their details were being used for when it came to advertising. So you can see at the top that those bullets there, we selected companies for our survey. We chose a mix actually of some companies that had offerings in both countries just to see whether there was a difference in the requirements within the different countries. But also we selected some individual companies in each jurisdiction, particularly where companies within a sector were more bespoke. For the likes of alcohol retailers, they didn't have, the same retailer didn't supply both the UK and Denmark, so we had one of each in there. We purely undertook desktop research. We didn't contact the companies at all. What we wanted to do was look at the information that was actually available in the public domain, usually contained in the specific terms and conditions. That was where we found the majority of the invite, or there were specific links on websites. Most commonly, that was really for the case of the likes of data protection policies and cookies policies. The results of our survey have all been anonymised, so all member firms were randomly numbered just in order to preserve privacy. So what I won't be sharing on the presentation today is the names of the different companies that we looked at because, well, I don't have their consent to do so, but we wanted to make it an anonymous study. But what I want to make clear just at the start is that our analysis didn't include any assessment of compliance with statutory obligations. So we weren't testing whether somebody was compliant with the obligations. It was purely an assessment that was of the information that was publicly available, and actually how comprehensive that we analysed that. Sorry, I've got some feedback from somebody. I don't know whether we can go on mute. That's better. Can we just move on to the next slide, please, on the presentation? Fantastic. I think this slide looks fairly busy, but hopefully it's fairly impactful, just setting out where we considered that companies had either detailed, moderate, or limited or no information in respect to the different areas that we reviewed. I think, you know, it's really pleasing to note the number of green areas across the different companies, across the different sectors, and across the different jurisdictions as well. And our findings showed that the majority of the member firms, their websites had really comprehensive and easily accessible information within their terms and conditions in most of the areas that we looked at. There was one outlier. One member firm did actually require an account to be opened before we were able to view terms and conditions. So that was an outlier within the industry. But once an account was opened, the terms and conditions on there were really easily accessible. I think conversely, the non-member firms didn't have a lot of detail in a number of areas other than the financial services industry. Probably not unexpected for that type of industry. The financial services industry has been really heavily regulated for a number of years. But actually, given the services, the types of services provided by the non-member firms, we wouldn't actually consider that to be unusual in a lot of the areas we're looked at. And I'll explain that as we go through, as I go through a little bit further detail through the next part of the presentation. You probably see from that table, there's two areas that all firms across both non-member and members had full information on, specifically in the UK, and that was data protection and advertising. But what I want to do is just have a bit of a whistle-stop tour and just look at the different areas, particularly where there wasn't detailed information online. So let's have a look at Know Your Customer first of all. There was only one member firm out of all 6 that had partial information, and that was on their Danish website. Everybody else had detailed information publicly available. For non-member firms, no KYC requirements at all noted on the websites in either of the jurisdictions for esports, only partially present on the UK site for the alcohol retailer, and actually not present on the Danish site when it came to alcohol retailer. For everybody else, there were at least moderate or partial information on the non-member firm websites compared to the member firms and their peers. When it came to customer safety, really pleasing, I think, to note that all member firms had detailed information relating to customer safety. None of the non-member firms, though, had detailed information regarding their wider customer safety practices. I think it's important that I point out that just because information isn't within terms and conditions, it doesn't mean to say that there internally aren't policies and procedures in place that perhaps wouldn't be available to us as members of the public, or things are just not stated in their terms and conditions. I think a good example to demonstrate that is when we consider safety, particularly in terms of gambling companies, affordability has really been at the key. It's really been at the forefront of considerations, you know, not letting people gamble with money that they can't afford. If you then compare that to something like financial services, also very heavily regulated, which shows as amber and red on our reports, affordability in that respect would be looking at lending to customers, making sure people aren't borrowing more than they can afford to pay back. And that has had really heavy oversight for a number of years, albeit I guess that would be more in terms of conditions of a specific product. So if you, for example, go to take out a mortgage, there's going to be terms and conditions around, you know, the amount that you can borrow and the criteria around then. So just because something's not in the general terms and conditions, it doesn't mean to say that it wouldn't be in a product service terms and conditions. Just moving on to data protection, that was actually one of the strongest categories that we found. The majority of the companies had really detailed information spanning across both jurisdictions, only 2 exceptions being the esports company based in Denmark and also the Danish alcohol retailer. I think potentially, and as Dave mentioned before, you know, GDPR came in, I think it was 2018, back in May 2018. So it really strengthened the requirements right across the board in a number of different areas, but particularly in respect of data protection. So it was good to see that was a real area of strength. Anti-money laundering, only 2 of the member firms had just partial information in respect of anti-money laundering practices, both within the Danish and the UK sites, and all others had pretty detailed information on there. And the majority of non-member firms, again, other than financial services, didn't have any information in relation to AML. But actually, we really wouldn't consider that to be unusual given the types of activities that are carried out by those firms. And then just finally, advertising, another really strong category in addition to data protection, particularly for the UK, where all companies, so both members and non-members, had really detailed information on their websites. And looking at the member firms, you'll see there was only one company that had limited information on its Danish site in respect of advertising. Everybody else did have full information spanning both Denmark and the UK. And I think we found that although there was detailed information on the UK sites, the majority of the non-member firms had limited information on their Danish sites when it came to advertising. So I know it's kind of allocated 10 minutes for this side of my presentation. It's a fairly whistle-stop tour of the key findings. The full findings are going to be set out within our report, which I understand is due to be published on the EGBA website by the end of the week, and I'm sure Barry will correct me if I'm wrong there. But you know, overall, I think a number of firms' terms and conditions were pretty standard across the company. So where we looked at companies that spanned across both jurisdictions, and there was evidence though that they had been tailored to meet the country-specific requirements where there was different obligations within each country. I think it's important as well, actually, that I make it clear, you know, we're not saying that there's a regulatory requirement to have all of this information in the terms and conditions. For when it comes to anti-money laundering, you know, there's no regulation that says you need to let somebody know in your terms and conditions when you're going to report them if you've got suspicions. But I think overall our findings show that the member firms came out really strongly in pretty much every area that we looked at in respect of making customers aware of the protections in place. I think probably whether customers actually read terms and conditions is another debate, but actually I think it's important to finish off by saying that, you know, just because something is stated in terms and conditions, it doesn't actually mean to say that it happens in practice, or just because something isn't stated in terms and conditions, it doesn't mean that it doesn't. So that's it. That's kind of whistle-stop tour of our findings of the study. I hope that was interesting.